kind of opportunities for innovation and technologies to enter our homes and help us age gracefully at home have really fundamentally changed the paradigm in many important ways.
So let me do a little bit of introduction, brief one to this panel and some of the ideas that we're going to talk about. We'll get straight to the conversation. It may seem odd to some of the people on this conference that we're talking about longevity on a conference about innovation, but in many ways, human longevity is one of the great innovations of the last century and a half. In 1870, the average life expectancy in the US was 39.4. By 2020, it was almost exactly to the decimal point, twice that number. Put another way, we've added more years of human life in the last 150 years than all of human history combined. And most of that is a result of innovations, innovation in healthcare, sanitation, and urban development, and education. But recent years have shown some limits to our innovations, both in terms of the steady progress of longevity, in terms of who gets the gift of longer life and who doesn't, how we can make longer lives healthier and more rewarding, and how we serve an aging America. Progress going forward requires more innovation, and fortunately, we have three great thinkers and innovators with us to discuss this challenge. As Matt mentioned, ILANA HORWITZ is a sociologist of education and religion, and the Fields Ryan Chair in Contemporary Jewish Life at Tulane University. Prior to joining the faculty at Tulane, she was a New Map of Life Fellow at the Stanford Center on Longevity, where she studied the role of education and learning on healthy longevity. She's the author of a wonderful new book, God Grades at Graduation, Religion's Surprising Impact on Academic Success. Alan PATRICOF is one of the great pioneers of venture capital in the United States. He's the founder of Apex Partners, of Greycroft, and more recently of Primetime Partners, a venture fund solely focused on serving aging America. He is also the author of the forthcoming memoir, No Red Lights, Reflections on Life, 50 Years in Venture Capital, and Never Driving Alone, coming out on May 3rd. NIRAV SHAH is a senior scholar at Stanford University School of Medicine and the chief medical officer of Sharecare. Previously, he was the chief operating officer of Kaiser Permanente in Southern California and the commissioner of the New York State Department of Health. And despite not having a book coming out this quarter, he is still a nationally recognized leader in digital health and innovation, care transformation, patient safety and quality, and the strategies required to transition to high-value, patient-centered care. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to start the questions off with NIRAV, but I do want to say to the audience, anytime you want to put a question in the Q&A, feel free to go ahead. I'm not going to wait till the end. If there's a relevant question you have now, feel free to ask it, and I will try to work it in. So let's start talking about the pandemic. Crisis has also been sources of innovation as well. NIRAV, in the healthcare space, what have you seen happen over the last 2 years that you think are relevant to longevity that gives you a sense of how the future will look?
So several things have happened over the last 2 years that really busted a lot of myths, starting with the fact that telehealth finally took off. We understand that care can happen remotely, and many doctors never believed that this would happen in their lifetime. They weren't ready for it. In fact, at my own institution at Stanford, we went from 0% telehealth visits in primary care to 75% telehealth care visits in 3 weeks. Obviously, the pendulum has swung back now, but the kind of opportunities for innovation and technologies to enter our homes and help us age gracefully at home have really fundamentally changed the paradigm in many important ways. We'll get into it a little bit later with specific technology examples and all, but I think that the new possible is now people don't want to go back to the old way of doing things. And despite healthcare not changing fast enough and moving backwards now after the pandemic or at this stage of the pandemic, we're still excited to see the valuations on from venture capital in digital health of $40 billion invested last year, and many other ways to see that finally we're going to actually start to transform care in our lifetimes.
Great. So Alan, first of all, let me draw everyone's attention to that backdrop you have carefully placed. There we go. So that no one misses this, coming May 3rd, no red lights. Alan, during the pandemic, what about the innovation community? How has it responded to the changing needs of that comes with longer life, to caregiving, to serving an older population? What have you seen and what have you encouraged?
Well, you know, it's kind of a nascent area, the investment in things related to longevity. Although I would say in the last couple of years, the subject of wellness has certainly become very big. I've been involved on the board of Thrive Global, which is Ariana's Huffington's company, which is now 4 years old, which is focused around wellness. The amount of innovation is, honestly, from a technological standpoint, has really not been that dramatic yet, but it is, COVID has certainly helped it. I mean, if the baby boomers weren't computer illiterate in 2019, a huge percentage of them are today, and they're doing more than emails. They're having, obviously, to do their shopping, their deliveries, their entertainment. It's all happening online, and something that hadn't happened before. We've, just to give you one area, we've looked at the remote patient monitoring area, which is because of just what was brought up about people aging at home alone, and also in senior living facilities. Everybody wants to know all their vital signs, what they're doing, did they fall, who were their visitors, how many hours did they sleep. And as a result, and I am not exaggerating, but it'll give you an idea, that we have logged in, and for those who want to test me, I'll give you the name of 35 companies doing what they call RPM, remote patient monitoring, with every kind of technology, from radar to computer vision to RFID to sensors. I mean, it's just astounding. And I think that is an indication of what's happening. But in general, there is a lot happening in this area of caregiving, and people who, like me, if you do read my book, I intend to live to 114. That's 27 more years. I've got to have a lot of things that are going to have to help me to get there, besides just manual endeavors. So I think there's a great opportunity in the whole field of longevity and technological innovation, and we're just at the beginning stages.
Good. We'll come back to healthcare and sort of the changing nature of healthcare momentarily. But let me ask you, ILANA, what have you seen in the world of lifelong learning, of education, that has changed during the pandemic that might give you a signal of what the future could be?
So my answer is a lot less optimistic than NIRAV's, and that is because education is a fundamentally different kind of enterprise. What happened during the pandemic, as probably many people in the audience know, is that we moved to online learning, All these remote learning opportunities popped up all over the place. And so for a lot of people, that might be a signal of, oh, we're changing the way we can do education. It's going to become so much more accessible and available to people, and it's going to become free, and people can access it anytime. And this is going to be sort of the magic bullet that that makes a dent in the educational attainment rates in our country. But as a sociologist with an understanding of sort of the historical processes of our education system, I'm very skeptical of that. And that is because education is something that is largely a political and social problem. The educational problems we have in our society are social and political problems that cannot necessarily be changed through these kinds of technical solutions, right? We had the MOOC, the massive open online education initiatives that were happening, about a decade ago. And we thought, oh, surely this MOOCs phenomenon is going to open up education to everybody, but it didn't really move the needle. So from where I sit, I'm not super optimistic that remote learning is going to sort of be the panacea that's going to solve the social and political problem of education.
Is there a greater demand? I mean, whether it's remote or not, the notion, even from the Great Resignation, people changing jobs, changing careers, and with greater velocity, that there's going to be a greater demand for lifelong learning, for training, that either business or government or society as a whole has to respond to.
Yeah, so I think when I say remote learning isn't going to fix education, I'm speaking specifically or predominantly around K-12 education. Where I do think it has the potential to make an impact is around sort of working learners and people who are looking for different credentials later on in the life course. Because here's a really fundamental thing for people to understand, right? As we live longer, there's going to be so many more opportunities and and times where you're going to come in and out of the workplace, right? Because it used to be in the old way of life, in the old map of life, we kind of had this life where it's like, okay, you go to school 0 to 20 years old, right? And then you work, and then you have a kid, and then you keep working, and then you maybe have some more kids. But it was much more linear. But in this new map of life where we're living so much longer, it means that we're going to be changing jobs much more often. And that also means that we need to be coming in and out of the education system much more often. So those opportunities to get reskilled along the life course, those are things that remote learning and sort of innovations that came up during COVID might be more able to accommodate and help people with those kinds of reskilling.
We were encouraged to interrupt each other. ILANA, I'm not at all disagreeing, but I'm emphasizing what's happening is to people like me who are having, Primetime is my third startup. I started actually at age 85. I started my second one at 72. So I think people are going to be re-entering the workforce, perhaps in a new version of what they did last time, or a completely new activity. And as you and I were discussing yesterday, this whole idea of people getting certifications in new areas, and people, there's a book that just came out by I'm plugging Michael Clinton's book called Roar, which is all about what people do in a second or third life of people who are aeronautical engineers decide to become real estate brokers, or real estate brokers decide to become professors. People are going to be re-entering, and as you said, re-entering the workforce.
Yeah, Alan, but I'm a little less rosy than you. I think there's haves and there's have-nots. With the pandemic, my kids were fine because we had high-speed internet at home. They could go to school sitting in their own rooms separately, whereas some of their classmates were sitting in cars at the school because that's the only way they had internet to log into school, right? That kind of haves and haves not has only gotten much worse over the last few years. We talk about longevity in the new 100. Well, actually, longevity in America, the average age has gone down by 2 years, whereas it's only gone down a half year because of COVID in our comparison countries. We're now 5 years behind in the United States compared to our peer countries, developed countries, and that's getting worse. Even in 2021, we're actually going backwards while the rest of the world is actually finally going forward. So the social determinants of health that ILANA has talked about, that we have to start paying more attention to, all that longevity, it actually didn't happen because of healthcare. It happened because of public health, and it happened because of the environment, because water was cleaner, because we finally had ways to actually do things in a preventative way that got maternal childhood mortality down. That's where the biggest gains happen. I'm not poo-pooing the gains, and that there won't be opportunities for rethinking the new map of life. But I think that we have to be very careful that the Gini coefficient isn't getting wider.
NIRAV, you've been hanging out with some sociologists. I love you bringing in this inequality dimension to this, because what a lot of people don't realize is this whole story of longevity about the gains in lifetime really have only been seen by people with a college degree. For those in the audience, I want you to take a second to think about how many people you think in America have a college degree. Okay, think of the number. It's a third. Okay, most people, especially sort of people in professional schools, business schools, tend to think that the number is higher because they are surrounded by people with college degrees, but only a third of Americans have a college degree. And those third of Americans are the people who see longevity gains. So there are 2/3 of Americans who are not seeing the benefits of longevity, and COVID has exacerbated the inequality in profound ways.
Well, we're having a very healthy debate here, but in my parents' time, Alzheimer's. I don't think the word Alzheimer's even existed when they were there. People, they say someone is senile. I mean, what's happening now? People are living longer and incurring diseases that had never happened before, and that is really what's affecting it. If we find cures for some of these things, and I personally believe that cures for cancer are going to be, I think, within my lifetime. Alzheimer's is a different story, but there are so many things that if there are changes, they will change the dramatic longevity of people by a dramatic number over a period of time. Plus, pass Build Back Better, and we'll have broadband a lot broader than we have it today.
Well, that's going to be a good challenge. You need to have Joe Manchin in the audience for that conversation.
He is, or he will be.
God willing.
Yeah.
So let's actually, Rob, let's talk. I mean, longevity is not just a healthcare issue, but there's a big healthcare component to longevity and equitable longevity. So that you guys were talking about who gets to live longer and why, and that is only a part, only part of the American public has been granted sort of this gift of longevity. How do you see? What are the opportunities in healthcare to make healthcare more widely available, so that others can get this greater?
Well, actually, while we don't have broadband, most people at least has per family one of these, a smartphone.
Yeah.
It may not be the newest one, like my little old SE or an Android, but what this has allowed us to do is to democratize care in a big way. Even telephone access to healthcare is access to healthcare. It's a start. It's much more than we had just a few years ago. And so I'm actually very optimistic that even something as simple as this, with the rise of telehealth, we're now giving people access to care in ways that they didn't have before. And we're talking about underserved frontlines, essential workers, all of those other folks who either were on Medicaid or had poor access because they were underinsured or uninsured. Even they now start to have access with something as simple as this. And so this has been a great democratizer. There's a lot of work being done right now around digital diagnostics and digital therapeutics. This phone right now actually has, you put your finger over the camera, and any smartphone built in the last 10 years, you can get a full set of vital signs now with some of the new apps. That means you don't, if you're worried about COVID, you could actually cough into your phone and it'll know if it's a wet cough or a dry cough. It'll give you your oxygen saturation, your blood pressure, your respiratory rate, your heart rate, and a score of whether you need to go in because you need evaluation or not. And that's today. Those kinds of technologies are now available to us and everyone. And that's what's exciting. So while we have a perfectly designed healthcare delivery system, $4 trillion healthcare delivery system, it's been designed to deliver more and more healthcare. It's not been designed to deliver more and more health. We're finally getting to more and more health.
So who changes that? And I'd love, Alan, if you would weigh in on this as well. But let me first ask NIRAV, is it government rulemakers? Is it the innovation sector? Is it patient advocates? Is it the United Healthcares of the world? What actually makes this broad base rather than something that's cool in Silicon Valley?
Well, I think it's a lot. Actually, I think it's us. I think it's us finally demanding it. Right now, we have high deductible health care plans where the first $5,000 comes out of my pocket before I get a dollar paid toward my health care. I'm going to start making decisions about where I go, and I'm going to care about quality. I'm going to care about, are you going to order extra tests I don't need? Are you going to actually give me the prevention up front that will keep me alive longer? Those are the kinds of things we're finally being empowered to do. And I'm not saying all of us have the ability to do that, or we have the information available to us, but that direct-to-consumer model that is now predominant everywhere and now finally entering healthcare means that the middleman is not your insurance company. It's not even your doctor. It's you getting the care you think you need. And maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, but over time, I'm hoping at least the access will allow you to then, over time, get the care you need in ways that we never had access to even 5 years ago.
I think what Nav is saying is 110% correct. I mean, I was involved with a company which has now been actually purchased called Vitals, which started a healthcare transparency 5, 6, 7 years ago, and it's only in the last year or two that transparency of healthcare costs is really something that's becoming more and more available. Instead of going and getting an MRI down the street on Park Avenue in New York, the health plan will send a taxi for me and take me down to 14th Street, and it will cost them $100 or $200. And I think the more you have transparency, more people are going to be making choices, are going to be encouraged and be given financial incentives to make those choices. And I think that we're in an era, and I think the government is supportive of it. And I think the health plans are doing an awful lot, and I give them credit in providing lots of supplemental services. The objective of every health plan, every provider, is to keep someone out of 1 day in the hospital. That's the total objective. Keep them at home do anything you can, and it's worth a lot of money to prevent one day. And I think that with transparency and with new tools available, we're going to see a healthier society.
I'm curious, Alan. I mean, one of the things I just would love to sort of get your experience on is an observation on whether American companies are too obsessed with younger customers. By the time I hit 65, the last of the baby boomers, there'll be more people over the age of 65 than under the age of 18. But companies
You've stolen my line. You've stolen my line. I mean, that's the major line.
Oh, that's me.
It's the fastest growing part of the population. More money to say they have bigger Rolodexes and more experience, so they're really a very valuable source. You go to a venture capitalist office, I defy you to find someone in the waiting room who's under the age of 30 or 35. And we've, ignored all these people like yourself and people on this phone call who are over the age of, I assume over the age of 35, maybe not attending as participants, who have tremendous talent that's available. And I think that we're going to see a lot more happening and a lot more creative thinking in this area. But I'm obviously very positive, very optimistic about the opportunities.
Yeah. So I gotta ask you one question that was the first question from the audience. When you were first talking, someone wanted to know why 114?
I get asked it all the time. I'll tell you, because I heard a lecture about maybe 10, or I can't tell you the exact date, at Mount Sinai by the head of the gerontology there. And at that time, he said, it was a he, I don't remember his name, that we could live to 114. And the only reason we didn't is because on the way, we got cancer, tuberculosis, we got run over by a car, things happen, a hip replacement, and every one of them took prostate cancer. Everything took 6 months, a year, whatever it was that happened to you. And that's why we end up with a lifespan of 75 or whatever expected lifespan. And I decided, even though I had a few of those maladies, that I liked the idea of 114. And so I set myself that goal, honestly, 10 years ago. And I've been saying it ever since, and it's in my book. And I really, anyone who knows me knows that I really am going to get there. I mean, I'm planning to run the marathon in November. That's 26 miles. The last time I did it was in the 1980s, running it. And I run my life that way. And I think that positive thinking, and studies have been made, that the people who live longer, maybe someone on the phone here said it the other day, if you think that way and you act positively, that will increase your longevity in itself. So that's how I picked 114. And by the way, I believe that if he gave that same lecture today, and maybe someone could comment on that, I think that number would be 120. And I just read someplace yesterday that, which I didn't know, maybe I mentioned, the oldest person who's ever lived was 123, except maybe for Methuselah, who proved he existed. And the oldest living person right now is 119.
Thank you, Alan. So ILANA, Alan mentioned something actually, I think very important there, about sort of the importance of leveraging older workers, whether they're in the waiting rooms at a venture capital firm or any business. We have a hard time in this country retaining older workers. The Great Resignation was also the Great Retirement, and we lost a lot of older workers during the pandemic. To early retirement. What is the role of education in helping older workers, the role of training and education, and what do you think of sort of the explosion of certificate programs in this country doing to help older workers stay employed for their economic reasons and for their own for their purpose in life?
I want to talk about older workers, but before that, I actually want to talk about a different dimension of this that underlies your question, and that is this misconception that we have and a narrative that we have in this country that, old people, or as people age, they're sort of a burden on society. we need to change this narrative. They are not a burden on society. They are actually a big asset, and we have not figured out how to leverage their years of wisdom and lived experience. And one of the things that people think about is that we need to front load education at the beginning of life because aging leads to cognitive decline. That's just not true. It is the case that there are developmental changes, but in fact, as people age, it actually becomes easier for them to learn some skills because we are not empty vessels to just be filled with knowledge. The way in which knowledge sticks in our brains is when we can actually relate it to something that we've already experienced, which is why for older people, it's easier to learn things like about, let's say, finance, because they've already played around with their checkbooks and they've spent money, right? It's much easier for them to understand sort of how banking works than it is for a 10-year-old or even a 15 or 20-year-old. And so there is this narrative shift that has to happen around aging as an asset and not a drain. And your question, Ken, about older workers and these certificate programs, yes, there are a lot of opportunities for people, as I mentioned earlier, to be skilled and reskilled. But unlike with healthcare, right? NIRAV talked about all of the amazing innovations that have happened with the iPhone, right? That you can breathe on it, you can cough on it. I had no idea that any of that could happen. But education is still largely, it's like we got Zoom and we got some teachers and sort of, we haven't caught up in the education space to really adapt to the technology. So there's a lot of room there, I would say, for innovators, for people on this call, to create some great opportunities for older workers to get reskilled.
So we have an observation from, less of a question, but more of an observation from someone in the chat. I'll just put it out there and ask whoever wants to respond to it in the context of what we can learn from other societies. So cultural problem, age segregation in the West is real. In the East, multi-generational living and respect for elders is often quite different. What do we think of the consequences of that, which I think is probably likely true against most dimensions? What do we think of the consequences of that for how we think about society and innovation and what we can get from how we can leverage the wisdom and experience of America's elders?
Let me start by just talking a little bit about what I saw in the last 2 years. Everyone realized we really don't want people in nursing homes. People don't want to be there. We want to be able to support them in homes with their families. We know that social isolation and loneliness are incredible problems that reduce life expectancy, cause mental health issues, many other problems as well. And other societies have figured this out. They age at home. They do not put their most wise seniors into homes because they don't have the care there. So we have now started, as the great return to home happened through COVID, because people were afraid of what nursing homes might do. We realized that huge caregiving gap that exists in America. AARP talked about a $500 billion, 2.5% of our GDP is contributed by unpaid family caregivers. That was pre-COVID. Since COVID, I'm sure that's gone up much more. And just because we ignore it and because the healthcare system says, it's not my job to pay for this, not my job to pay for this, doesn't mean that we as a society shouldn't figure out how to do this better. I think that's one of the great opportunities. Our eyes are open to the burdens of caregivers. And if we can support people at home to age gracefully, we don't need them to sell their house or mortgage it just to get on Medicaid and get in a nursing home anymore. If we can figure out the ways to keep them safe at home, I think technology can play a big part of that. It can assist and enable people. Japan is spending a lot of time with robots and older adults because that's one of their solutions. But we have the man force. We just haven't invested in that people force in the ways that other countries have.
So, Alan, what do you see? So I was actually a mentor and a Techstar Future of Longevity accelerator this year. I was the least qualified mentor, but so be it. And a lot of the companies in the accelerator were about caregiving. And it's obviously an area of great interest in long-term growth. What do you see happening? You talked about remote monitoring. What else is going on in that space that you think is of interest and will have a chance to transform caregiving in this country?
Well, caregiving, again, I said, everybody, you just heard that people want to age at home and are going to do everything possible to do it. And obviously, having hospice now more widely circulated is going to make a lot more people pass away, however we want to say it, die in their beds. I think that we're in a wave of time when home care is increasingly popular. I was on the phone yesterday for almost an hour with India, and I thought I was talking to one of the many caregiving companies we've talked to in the United States, because everything they're doing in terms of finding people who will service people at home with a health line, with caregiving, with transportation, is all the same things we're doing here. I mean, we're coming up with services to take care of people so they can age at home, and it has implications for housing long term, and the types of housing, and the types of physical facilities, and what will be contained within those facilities. I don't have to tell you, there are now toilets that have been developed that can do urine analysis. I'm sorry to be so specific, or it can take other techniques. I can't tell you what they are specifically, but I've seen them that can use the toilet as a monitoring for all kinds of things that will save going to the hospital to do it, or go to a doctor's office. So, I mean, people are focusing on how to take care of people at home. I mean, that's the bottom line.
So ILANA, I'm sort of curious from your perspective. I know you have children in school. You may have older parents as well. There's a lot of people in the sandwich generation trying to do caregiving up and down, both for younger people and for older people. What do you see as sort of the changes in that space that's coming? How are people in your generation dealing with this sort of challenge of balancing work and family care?
You know, I'm not sure that I have seen a tremendous amount of change. One thing that is important to point out is that this question about caregiving and intergenerational living is very class and culture specific. So my sort of, primarily like college and graduate school educated, middle upper class social group is not living at home with their parents, and is not really looking for parents to fill in those gaps, because those parents have retired and kind of want to do their own thing. But when I remember I taught a class at a community college in Palo Alto. I had 40 students. They were all, primarily first-gen low-income students, many from who were Latinx. And they were shocked that my parents didn't live with me, and that I didn't have cousins and aunts and uncles living with me, which is so normal in their own respective communities. And so I think a lot of this is about changing the social and cultural scripts. And I don't know if that happens through the media, but these are not technical, easy solutions, right? It's like, I know that it would be great to have my parents living with me from certain perspectives, but the amount of sort of social and cultural change that would need to happen for them to be on board with that, and for me to be on board with that, I'm not expecting to see that anytime in the coming decades.
What would your husband say?
I don't know. I actually think he would be thrilled.
But corporations.
Parents, the parents of my friend's generation also want to go live their life, and they plan to travel in their retirement, and they're doing that. So they're not committing to this intergenerational living anytime soon.
Ken, one of the things that's happening is corporations are very, very mindful of the lost hours of their employees who have to care for someone in their family. And so they're coming up and become a player in this scenario of, to reduce downtime for their employees, and they're giving that as a supplemental benefit. In addition to childcare, they've got both ends they've got to worry about. And most interesting thing I found, I mean, I've learned several things in the course of the last couple of years with Primetime, is the number of companies that have been started by younger people who have someone in their family that's needed care of some sort, and that's what's got them interested and aware of what the problems are in this area. So, and we're going to have more and more of those, older generation.
Ken, I see a comment in the chat about women staying at home, and I want to emphasize this point that COVID basically took so many women out of the workforce that I think like we have regressed by several decades in terms of making strides in professional advancement of women. And here is where I think there is a lot of opportunity for intervention and innovation, because women need to get reskilled, right? And to get back into the workforce. And they're also managing so many other responsibilities at home. And here's where I think technology can play a role in figuring out how to help people who, especially women who are sort of trying to both go back to school and have caretaking responsibilities. And by the way, it is low-income women in particular who are experiencing these setbacks, right? Because they cannot outsource their childcare to other people.
Ken, I want to bring up something else, because I asked you yesterday, how come longevity is a subject of a brand conference, or supposedly a brand conference?
Yeah.
In an area where there aren't that many brands, and it made me think just now of, I won't name the company, but a leading cosmetic company, yeah, I guess you'd call it, who all cosmetic companies, all they want to do is to tell women about preventing wrinkles and looking younger.
Yeah.
And there's a interesting debate going on in the whole cosmetic industry, not on the surface. How do you reconcile this with the fact that there are so many older people who, and should you be celebrating their aging rather than trying to avoid the appearance? I guess that goes for, you'll forgive me for baldness. It goes for gray.
I don't know why you would think of that
for
now.
graying hair. I mean, these are all inevitabilities. And I think the people who are dealing with those brands, that's where I got the brand going, ought to be thinking about how to build brands that celebrate older people, because there are
Well, I
more.
think the cultural constructs around aging in this country are fascinating and are worth a panel in and of itself. So NIRAV, here's a question from our good friend, anonymous attendee. With the massive adoption of telemedicine, we've seen an equal decrease in the use of preventive medicine services as patients opt to skip in-person only preventive screening exams, which are known to reduce healthcare costs, breast and lung cancer, x-rays, prostate cancer, et cetera. In your opinion, what does a striking the right balance look like?
Well, yeah, I think there was definitely, everyone was afraid, including doctors, of going to clinics and hospitals. So mammograms, everything was delayed and postponed. But remember, it's all about the incentives in healthcare. You get paid if you check off all these boxes when you're a health plan. And so there's going to be a catch up. I'm not so worried about the USPSTF grade A recommendations when it comes to mammograms and all of the things that we know work. We'll catch up, and they'll be, we're a few years behind. Some of that we'll have to pay the Pied Piper for that. On the other hand, there's other ways now we can get to some of those prevention technology in a much broader way. We know that when, for example, African-American women die disproportionately from breast cancer, we're now starting to find ways to communicate with them in different ways, and ways that actually get them into care earlier, into prevention earlier. The example I'll give you is at Kaiser, when I was chief operating officer in SoCal, we could prove that you live 3 years longer at Kaiser because we did such a good job with colonoscopies and all the other preventive work. Now, if everyone performed at that level across America, you'd see life expectancy go way up. So right now, the incentives are still, unfortunately, for expensive care at the end of life. It's still mostly a fee-for-service world in America. As much as we call and talk about value-based care, it's really about paying for each additional widget of care. It's not about paying for each additional widget of health. We're getting there slowly. I think it'll be another 5-10 years before we see widespread adoption, but we know what we need to pay for. When we start paying for it, suddenly everyone will make it happen. Insurance companies first, providers second.
Okay, so let's, since I have your attention, why don't I ask you sort of what are the changes that you see coming and you're most excited about?
Sure.
That really
Well,
towards this model.
you know, I am actually very excited, and it's perhaps because I live in a bubble inside a bubble in Silicon Valley, that healthcare is actually becoming more digital, mobile, virtual, continuous, remote, real world in real time. What does that mean? That means that today, the orthopedic surgeon is not going to get paid by United Healthcare until she gets patient-reported outcome measures. That means they actually have to find the patient after the surgery and say, are you able to walk and do the things you need to do in home, and report that back to the insurance company to get paid. How does that happen? More and more through the phone. So more and more of our, what we call outcomes, are based on what matters to individuals, what matters to people in their real world and in their real lives. And we have ways of capturing that data in ways that we never could when you came to a clinic maybe 3-4 times a year, or a hospital once a year. And so that continuous data function that we now have access to is going to actually improve health and overall care at much lower cost than when you relied on bricks and mortar, coming to the doctor. We don't have enough of them anyway, to try to improve each individual care.
Thank you. So Lana, before I'm going to ask you that question, but I do want to thank you for putting in the chat for everyone's use. You put in a link to a report from, I assume you did, at the Stanford Center on Longevity, about longevity and education. So everyone, that is available, link to that is available for the chat. So Alana, what are you most excited about?
I'm not sure if I'm seeing a lot of evidence of this happening, but here's what I hope will happen. So we've talked about these certificate programs or different modes of getting credentials. We've been talking about it as this one-way street where I go and get a credential, but the labor market is not a one-way street. It's a two-way street where I also need the employers to evaluate that and have that certificate signal something of value. A lot of the sort of sociology of studying credentials points to the fact that it's not about what you learn, it's about the degree that you have, right? Because if you are an employer who has 30 resumes or 300 resumes, right, you're quickly going to figure out how to weed out the people who don't have a college degree. You're probably going to find the people from the more elite institutions. And so what I want to see happen is employers thinking differently about how to evaluate credentials, because that I think will make the process of getting jobs and having these sort of alternative certification programs much more equitable, because those jobs right now, if we're going off of the old system of evaluating candidates based on the colleges that they went to, right, it very much favors the already elite people who are already in the best position to get the jobs. So that's one thing I hope. I'll say another one that we haven't talked so much about is, you know, there's a profound problem of despair in America. We have seen it for several decades. And I think this, and it's cognitive, it's emotional, it's physical, and it is what has really hindered, I think, longevity gains amongst working class communities. Unfortunately, I think COVID and the has exacerbated this problem, because now everybody is feeling the social isolation that creates this level of despair. I'd love to see ways for us to rebuild those social bonds and social ties of society.
Thank you. On your first, thank you for both those points. On your first point, I do want to call out a report that Joe Fuller at Harvard Business School did with Accenture, I think last September, called Hidden Workers, a little about how technology used by HR parts of companies actually excludes a lot of workers, weeds them out before they even have a chance to get a job, and keeps by their calculation some 27 million people in long-term unemployment or underemployment. It's a fascinating report. Alan, you get the last word. What do you want to see happen in the next 20?
I want to happen in the next 26 hours. Shameless and hold up my book again, May 3rd. You know, one of the bottom line is in never driving alone. One of the things that we should be concerned about is COVID keeping us all at home and losing the ability of being together. That's not technological. I remember reading, I thought it was 4 or 5 years ago, but it turned out to be 15 years ago, Bowling Alone, which was one of the great books, as far as I'm concerned, about how we've changed and how we've lost that whole community spirit. And there's so much to be gained. And I am a big believer in everybody be back in the workplace. But that's second. Actually, the thing I'm most excited about is not an area of my investment because I don't do it, but I think it's the key. It's the most important, and that's biotech. I think the opportunities are going to be here, whether it's for gene sequencing or for monoclonal antibodies or new technologies in the pure healthcare field, and new drug discoveries. I really do believe we're going to find an answer for cancer. We're going to find in everyone on this phone's lifetime. But there are so many diseases that really are going to be subject to breakthroughs, and that's going to change the longevity dramatically and our overall health. And unfortunately, we don't have the skill to analyze those. But I can't help but say I think that's a very exciting area for investment and participation.
Thank you, Alan. So thank you all three of you for this great conversation. I'll do one last book plug, since that's a theme here. On this new book, God's Grades and Graduation, is available right now, and you can pre-order. No red lights at any time. If you want to find out more about longevity, you can visit our website at longevity-project.com, or the website of the Stanford Center on Longevity at longevity.stanford.edu. Or last plug, you can listen to the Stanford podcast Century Lives, which I host, available wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you.